The ways in which participation in epistemological concepts that are critical to disciplines are really essential for transfer from one context to another. So that really has to do with helping students learn to recognize those concepts as a way to identify boundaries around different communities that operate, whether inside the academy or outside the academy. And that's one thing I've really focused on in my research at Elon.
I think there are two things that are really interesting. One is the method that we've developed for doing text-based interviews using Camtasia. So the work that we do with students where they come in, they do interviews, and we record how they're talking about revisions that they made to their pieces and using the same sort of research questions and categories that we have to talk about their own pieces, but we're tying it to texts that they have. And then the second thing I would say is the chance for us to work around the term dynamic transfer and to start thinking not just about the target context, but the way in which the target context affects language. We're really trying to think about this concept of tools and how tools that can be put into place in the target context play back and draw on prior knowledge that was developed, say, in first-year comp when students are writing in upper division classes.
My interest has always been in student transitions from academia into internships, workplace, that I personally didn't have a great experience with that, so I always try to bring it back to my students to give them some of the strategies that I didn't have when I went into the workplace, to take a lot of the rhetorical theories that I had learned but hadn't really figured out how to apply in a realistic context. So I do a lot of service learning work, a lot of highly collaborative long-term projects for my students. And in this particular transfer project, I was looking at how different aspects of reflection could help improve the potential for transfer. So it was a large service learning course with a large-scale project. The students did two types of reflection. They did written journals, and then I practiced, I'm developing a pedagogy based on agile project development methods in software. So at the end of every kind of chunk of the project, we would have what we call a retrospective. So the students would sit in a large group and reflect on what they learned, reflect on what went well, what was a challenge, what they can take into the next piece of their project to continue their development. So they're very actively reflecting on the different types of ways they can bring different aspects of their own learning from different areas and from the project into their continued work and transferring into their grant writing projects.
But in terms of writing itself, looking at the different reflective moves that students make and looking at the role of metacognition, and we're also really focusing on identity, and we're focusing on dispositional qualities and a lot about like students' beliefs and reactions to curriculum and transfer. Those are things that we're still in our initial data analysis, but those are things that we're seeing come through. And I think one of the things that was really interesting coming out of it for me was looking at how over time we can actually see students focusing more and more on transfer and on thinking about building those connections between the current class and their prior knowledge at the beginning, and then the current class and where they're hoping to take it in the future. And not just other academic contexts, but personal contexts, students that are going to their church and writing a newsletter and using rhetorical information. And so it's pretty exciting to see that kind of information happening and those kinds of connections being built and moving across those different contexts.
As a result of the participation in the Elon seminar, I was able to start a new transfer project, and I was able to sort of bring in what I had learned from my first transfer project and kind of address some of the both theoretical and methodological issues that I had seen there. So the number one thing I wanted to address was, in the first project, I had really been looking at what are students learning in A and taking to B. And what I realized was that's really too narrow because we don't know what they're bringing to bear in B. And so in this project, I'm really looking at what do they consider moments of rhetorical challenge, and then when they have those moments, what are they bringing to bear? And then the second thing that I think is maybe the most interesting out of the data that I have so far is just how much issues of class, gender, place are really important in these moments of rhetorical challenge in a way that I hadn't expected to see, and that I don't think we've talked a lot about in the transfer research.
We have to look at the students, where they are in this writing process, and how they are related to the assignment, how they are related to other students. So that's what I found, how the relations among the students and the relationship with the instructor and the class and the institution and even their college career goal Those are very important things. That would be, it's not like a very definite finding I have, but that is something that become very important. So the social culture perspective of how writing transfer happen is really the foundation of my interpretation and understanding.
My study is a lot like that Raymond Carver short story collection with the title What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. I think it's very much in the spirit of what we talk about when we talk about writing. And so I would say that one of the main things I've learned from my own studies is that a lot of our most privileged, valued expectations about academic writing remain tacit. And that unless we have this ongoing dialogue about what we mean by X, Y, or Z, we don't really know what we are talking about. And I mean individually and collectively. So I think that's the main thing. The other thing, and this was a hypothesis going into the study, because my study is very contextualized at my institution. There's a strong misalignment in when we do talk about what we expect between first-year comp students and writers, so within that program, but especially between first-year comp and what we call writing proficiency course or upper division writing. And then there's an even more dramatic contrast or misalignment between those and central administrators. And so my study was surveying, and I've been doing some focus groups about what people say they expect student writers to be able to know, do, and believe. And the misalignment is stark.
For my research project, I studied whether or not students transferred writing strategies from self-sponsored writing to academic writing. And what I found was that students showed an enormous amount of rhetorical sensitivity when they were engaging in self-sponsored kinds of writing. They all happened to have brought in digital kinds of self-sponsored writing, so blogging, texting, email, and creating web pages. They were able to talk very richly about the rhetorical situation, the audience, the purpose, the context, and especially with texting, students had kind of rather elaborate taxonomies when they talked about who they could text and when and what they could say and what time they could text. Some really interesting results came out of students talking about texting with grandparents or working on emailing or writing on Facebook with grandparents. And so that was very exciting to see, but when students talked about their academic writing, it was very bland. It was very boring. They would say things about audience. Well, I would write what my professor wanted me to write. And they would say, I knew he liked certain phrases, so I would use those phrases.
We've learned how important it is, one, for students to really recognize that there are these boundaries that exist around different disciplines. We knew that already, of course, because we recognize that qualities of good writing are context-specific. But we've really, through the Elon seminar, been able to dig into the specific qualities or threshold concepts of writing in two different disciplines, writing and history, and been able to look at how important it is to make those very explicit for students and to see the benefits of making them explicit for students, because students really become very effective at identifying those concepts across many communities when they learn to make them explicit.
I think the sort of generalizability questions go back to this question of thinking about how you can put pedagogical strategies or activities in place in the target context which will draw on prior knowledge. And in some ways, it stops being a question of transfer about a container moving from one thing to another, and more questions about the possibility of evoking prior knowledge and using that as part of a mechanism to encourage and build more effective transfer.